I want to talk about really is language. Language influences the way we think and the way we speak to one another. And language around capital is defined by accountants. Now, don't get me wrong, I like accountants, I've got a good one, but they're focused on classifying transactions and instruments so they can be measured and compared using numbers. Classifying share capital and equity requires the consideration of diverse variables that don't readily convert to numbers, I'm afraid. It's all very difficult and complex, and the hallowed halls of the Australian Accounting Standards Board are serious and Byzantine at the least. The problem with reducing everything to a measurable standard to enable comparison means either that we're only measuring one aspect of an organisation, or that some organisations don't get measured properly. So as I was saying, basically organisations don't really get measured properly, or at least some of them don't. In 2005, Australia adopted the International Accounting Standards. Now, I'm not going to talk about accounting standards all the time, but one of the things about the accounting standards coming to Australia was that it had an enormous effect on cooperatives. And it's epitomised by the story of a small co-op based in Yenda, or the Griffith area of the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. I choose this as a story to tell you because these people came along to the Senate inquiry into cooperatives and mutuals and told a great little story. So what they said was that in one financial year, they had over $18 million on the equity side of their balance sheet. And the next day, without any movement of capital, nothing else changed in their business, they had less than $4 million. It was a really interesting story that they told, and so they were trying to explain to the Senate committee what it was that their cooperative did, and they said, oh, well, we're irrigation specialists in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. We've got 80 employees. We helped over 100 schools and charities, and in the last 5 years, we distributed more than $7.5 million to members in rebates and dividends, most of that was then spent back in the local community. The other thing about their submission to the Senate inquiry was they said, we think for the long term, because we're here for members for the long term, that's what we're about. We like to think how we're going to help them now and into the future. And so with that kind of an attitude, they were some of the first organisations to hop on to the business of water trading allocations in the Murray-Darling Basin for their members. So that's what that cooperative is about, and it wasn't measured properly. It can't be measured using that kind of language. And there's many stories like that. I did find this great quote, supposedly written by Plato in the year 330 BC. He said, "Moneymakers are tiresome company, for they have no standard but cash." I thought, oh, that's our story today with the accounting standards. Anyway, I'll move on, because one of the things, I guess, that economic theorists and accountants talk about is the capital conundrum. What they mean by it is that the focus of co-ops on retaining autonomy from external capital in the pursuit of their cooperative principles, which include broader social or community purposes, this cuts them out of the normal capital markets, and that in turn compromises their financial success. For me, what that means is they don't much make the right kind of profit to attract investors. The farmers in Yenda don't seem to mind that. Their bottom line is much healthier because the co-op helps manage their market externalities that would cost them more to deal with themselves. But I guess by calling it a conundrum, economists are telling us that you can't have both. And I'm really not so sure that's true, because I think using the word conundrum or problem really is another language issue or a language obstacle. Because cooperative business models are more about spreading wealth and respecting the value of the community that supports it. Agricultural co-ops are usually fairly localised, geographically localised, and you can see the direct benefit from the existence of that co-op in the community. And so happily for Yenda, their loss of their equity in their local community was actually readily understood by their banker because their local community understood what they did, who they were. Other co-ops, however, attract a large non-geographical community that pursues a broader benefit, like the Service Cooperative for University Campuses that provides a buying power and business management advice to what used to be called student services. That's an enormous organisation across Australia. But many co-ops that are being formed today look to really big purposes, tap into bigger communities of interest. They don't look for a place in the top 500 companies, and their members and managers are not interested in being on the rich list. They're about solving the needs and aspirations of their communities, and they can do this really easily through social media these days. They can find and reach interest and commitment. So renewable energy co-ops like Hepburn Wind, and it's great to see Taryn here today, can proudly say that their reach extended well beyond their local geography, and they've now got a community that's powered by renewables, and they are an outstanding example of how that community power can come together to actually pursue a really powerful purpose. The Cooperative Life is another really good cooperative. It's a worker co-op in the home care services area. They can all say, we've all got jobs that are secure and rewarding. Sure, they'd like to make a profit, but in truth, they really don't care so much for the capital because they've got social capital. And that kind of capital is enduring, not bound up by the accounting standards. Sorry, accountants, really. They're really what we like to call the original social enterprises. And you know, the interesting thing is that we don't have a problem with using the word social enterprise. That's a buzzword for the moment. We think they're great. The current generation is faced with, you know, a really complex and difficult labour market. Media is concerned with really big issues about the environment. These are all problems and challenges that we'd like to be solving, but they can't be solved by capital, as the accountants define it. Now, Professor Greg Patmore at Sydney University is embarking on this fantastic project called a Cooperative Atlas. And what emerges from that is that co-ops come and go in response to community needs. And when I was working on the regulatory impact statement for the Cooperatives National Law, we did a little bit of number crunching. Numbers are not my forte, you'll probably understand that soon. About the end lives of different corporate entities. So we looked at the number of entities reported on the ASIC website for insolvencies that were actually went into liquidation during the global financial crisis, and we compared the number of end lives, if you like, for cooperatives over the same period of time. Now, I don't remember how many companies failed under that period of time in the global financial crisis, but we all know it's a lot. There were a handful of cooperatives that stopped existing, if you like, over that period. And I use that word carefully because none of them went down for insolvency issues. They all stopped operating because there was no longer a need for them. They found other things to do. So what's interesting about it is that they're not into that market. You know, when we talk about, there's not many left or they're dying at a particular rate, it's not a product of them not being successful. It's a product of why they come into being, and that is to serve the needs of the people who've created them. If the need's not there anymore, they will stop existing, and more will come along to take up their place. Interestingly, no one ever talks about social enterprises as being a conundrum. But one of the things about social enterprise, or the way we refer to social enterprise today, is that they're very good at measuring and saying what their success is because they're not constrained by that accounting language. one of the things that people often say to me is cooperatives will never grow into a major economic force. They usually say that when I tell them that I work in the co-op sector. And this conversation then inevitably leads to, well, what about Murray Goulburn? You know, they got too big, didn't they? And I said, well, what about HIH Insurance or OneTel? Or think about Wesfarmers, who had to sell their Bunnings network in the UK for £1. The thing about those sorts of comments is that when people talk about co-ops that fail, they say that as a challenge to the model itself. Whereas when we talk about companies that fail, they say, well, probably bad management, maybe a bit of greed, I don't know, but it's never a challenge to the model itself. And so co-ops have got a lot of language to overcome, language barriers to overcome. I like to think of them as different corporations. They are corporations after all. They have limited liability and they act and they're managed in the same way as any other corporation with a board of directors and members, that familiar model. It's democratically run, and sometimes that makes decisions a little bit slower to come about. However, the decisions are well thought through, is the way I like to think about it. So the co-op sector is still pretty small in Australia. Melina would probably be able to tell us the number. Still around 2,000, I guess, across the nation. And there are lots of factors, so that's pretty small compared to the number of companies there are, but there's lots of factors that contribute to the size of a particular sector. I actually thought that the modernisation of the co-ops law under the co-ops national law was going to lead to more growth because it was designed to remove competitive barriers faced by co-ops. Unfortunately, the growth hasn't been there. There is still some growth, but I'm thinking that maybe it's more than the law. And I think now that the key problem is that we don't really understand them. That marvellous research commissioned by the BCCM concluded that 8 in 10 Australians belonged to a cooperative or mutual enterprise, but very few knew that they did so. We just don't understand them. We don't teach about co-ops in schools. We don't teach about it in accounting or law courses at universities or colleges. You can ask any law or accounting student, or a professional for that matter, about cooperatives or corporations, and they'll tell you, well, companies are registered under the Corporations Act 2001, that's it. And if you say, what about cooperatives? The next thing is, well, what chapter in the Corporations Act are they? You have to tell them, well, there's a whole range of other legislative provisions there that deal with them because they're regulated at state law. We had a major change in our regulatory regime during the 90s that led up to the Corporations Act, and everybody got sucked into thinking that companies were the only real method for running a business. And of course, the mutual organisations, all of those financial co-ops, building societies and credit unions also got sucked into that rush, a bit like Yender's balance sheet. So one day they were building societies or credit unions, and the next day they were corporations or companies under the Corporations Act called mutual companies. They didn't know much about them either, other than the fact that the ASIC said, well, don't you do anything fancy with your share capital, because that'll put you on the road to demutualisation. So that's how well or how little we've understood these kinds of organisations. Having them regulated at state and territory level also has its problems because in each state and territory they're regulated by a government sector that also regulates incorporated associations and a whole range of other little entity types. Okay. In New South Wales, there's over 38,000 incorporated associations and maybe 600 to 700 co-ops. So you've got an enormous number of not-for-profits and charities on one side, some not-for-profit charitable cooperatives here, and some really big agricultural or other sorts of cooperatives over there. And so people tend to think, co-ops, they must be not-for-profits. And that's another language problem. because accountants tell us we have for-profits and not-for-profits, but co-ops really are in the middle. They're for-purpose organisations. That's another language we need to start to talk about for cooperatives, both for tax purposes as well as how we treat them in our day-to-day dealings. They are different corporations. But today I'm meant to be telling you about Co-op Capital, so I'll just flick through some things so we all know a little bit about each one of them. So co-ops issue shares. We call them member shares sometimes, but companies call their shares, their basic shares, ordinary shares. So I just gave them the name ordinary ones, just so that we can feel familiar about it. They've got dividend rights. They're a bundle of rights pretty similar to the way a corporate share, a company share is made up. They've got dividends. They don't have a vote attached to them, right? Because that belongs to your membership. They've got a fixed value. So what that means is you can't get a capital gain out of them. That's okay. People don't buy them for the capital gain. I think probably the thing that most people don't understand is that shares in a distributing cooperative actually have a share in the residual capital of the organisation when it's wound up. So as well as their nominal capital, I'm getting wound up here by Alex. But the biggest problem that people see with shares for co-ops is that they're withdrawable. They're not withdrawable at call, like a deposit in a bank. There are restrictions on how much you can withdraw them. But the thing about co-op shares, so I don't like to think of them really as being the same as shares. I think of them more as opportunities for people or businesses to create their own enterprise that does the things that they want. The share capital is the member's risk. Okay, it is, but the primary connection to the cooperative is its membership, and that's what gives it its long-term focus and planning ability. So they're here for the long term, and don't forget, that's a really powerful thing that you can't manage or measure. But there's one story I want to tell you. Oh, please, I'm not going to get a nod off here. I'm not going to tell you about co-op capital units because Anthony's going to do that. All right, I want to tell you about the other thing that they can do. They can issue debentures, okay? They can issue them to members or they can issue them to the public. And I had the honour of being on the board of the Bathurst Whole Food Cooperative, and they needed $40,000, couldn't get it from a bank because they didn't have any assets really. So they went to their membership, a really powerful base of people within that community, and they raised $40,000 in less than a month to buy new equipment. They borrowed it from their members for 4 years at a 2% interest rate. The best interest they could get, even if a bank would lend it to them, was 12%. Okay? So the thing about debentures is that they have a local community competitive advantage. And so with that, I'm going to go across to Anthony, who's looking stern, but not unhappy. And he's going to tell you more about capital cooperative units later. But as I said, I'm around here for the rest of the day, so please come and talk to me about different fundraising methods for cooperatives. Thanks for your attention. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day.